Hello, this is the third video for Bible Survey for the week prior to spring break here in the coronavirus altered semester. Didn't get a lot of questions from you all as you're adjusting to the kind of new setup for things, but did get a handful, or three or four. So just want to respond or comment about some of those quickly as we come back from break. Would love to get questions. So how I kind of like to format the remaining weeks of the semester are I'm going to produce two videos early in the week that'll essentially be lectures that we would have had in class on New Testament material, and then kind of give you a couple days to post questions or ask for further clarification for from those two videos for anything for the third video of the week. And then I'll make that later on typically Thursday or Friday morning for that week. And about half of that video will be me responding to questions that you might have, and trying to create just a little bit more of an interactive space with this rather than just me cranking out 50-minute videos that you kind of passively just watch over and over again as we try to work our way through this and navigate through. So one question that I got, which is this is a great question because people, this isn't the first time I've heard this. So in the last video, we talked about the idea of Markan priority, or the concept that Mark was likely the first gospel written, and that Matthew and Luke have access to it and essentially kind of copy it almost word for word with minor changes and then add material onto it, right? So actually, a couple of the questions I have are related to this Markan priority question. So one question from Josie was, if Mark is first, why isn't it listed first in the Gospels? Like, why or in the New Testament? So in virtually all Christian Bibles, they begin with the Gospel of Matthew. It goes Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. If Mark is first, why doesn't it come in our gospel? And that is basically because there's probably a couple of factors there, but the primary one is that this idea that Mark is the earliest gospel is really about a 200-year-old idea. So as kind of biblical scholarship became a more advanced field, and kind of better tools for analyzing the text and whatnot, Markan priority has developed over time. But for most of the church history, most church traditions held that Matthew was the first gospel written. And so it appears first in the New Testament because for the vast majority of the history of the church, it was just tradition. Now, it was never claimed dogmatically that we knew without a doubt Matthew was the first, or that it was all that ultra important to think that Matthew was first. But that was certainly kind of the tradition held, that Matthew was the first gospel. So why? Why did the church for so long think Matthew was first and not Mark? It seems mostly to be the case, and this is in some ways kind of information for like a church history class, is that when we kind of the earliest mentionings of the gospel. So, like, one of the things we really need to keep clear is that when, like, Paul in later in the New Testament talks about Scripture, or anyone, Jesus talks about reading Scripture, they don't have any of the New Testament, right? For everyone in the New Testament that mentions God's Scripture or Holy Scripture in any kind of way, they're referencing the Jewish Bible, what we would call the Old Testament, the Hebrew Bible. And so, like, one of the things is, like, when exactly did Christians start to have an idea that they were going to add on an entirely new collection of books to the Hebrew Bible, and that it would have the same kind of authority or weight, or perhaps even more for many Christians than the Old Testament had? And that's a process that takes a few hundred years, really, kind of starting at the end of the first century. There's beginning statements, even a little bit in the New Testament, where, like in First Peter and stuff, where references to Paul's letters as having some kind of weight or authority to them. But a lot of kind of how we can track the early church sort of figuring out that, hey, we're going to have some new scripture. In some ways, I don't want to make this a controversial statement, but in some ways, similar to how Latter-day Saints or Mormons would say, well, we have a third piece of scripture. We accept the Old Testament, the New Testament, and the Book of Mormon, right? So in a way, not totally different than that. Early Christians were trying to decide, hey, are these Gospels, are these letters from Paul, this book called Acts of the Apostles, is this worthy of thinking of these books alongside the Hebrew Scriptures, which they had fully accepted for centuries? And as we have copies of that process, it's very sparse and sporadic, but we have early sermons. Like there's some texts of sermons that are preached as early as kind of the very end of the first century and into the second century. And in those sermons, and there's not many, there's just a handful of a few kind of church fathers in the first several decades of the church. The first gospel that gets quoted in any of those sermons is the Gospel of Matthew. And Matthew appears in a smattering, quotes from Matthew appear in a smattering of these oldest sermons that we have, which I think led, most scholars think led kind of the early church to think, well, if this is the one being quoted earliest and most often, it must be first or most important. And it's certainly true that in the early church, Matthew was a very popular gospel. It was used quite a bit, which kind of leads to a second question that Josie had, and that is if Matthew, as I said in the prior video, if one of the themes of Matthew is that it's very Jewish, that the author is appealing to kind of trying to make connections to how Jesus' story relates to the Jewish story, how Jesus fits within Judaism, how he interacts with Torah or the law from a Hebraic or Jewish sense. Who is that toward? Like, why don't Jews today read that then? Why do they reject all of the Gospels and not accept Matthew if it's particularly Jewish? And I could have been more clear on this. So wanting to kind of explain this in the early, and we'll talk more about this when we get to the book of Acts, but in the early, for about the first 40 to 50 years, the vast majority of Christians would have seen themselves as Jewish followers of Jesus as the promised Messiah, right? So certainly in the first couple decades, almost all of the earliest Christians came from within Judaism. In fact, for quite a while, Judaism is kind of like a subset, or Christianity is sort of a subset of Judaism, really until about 70 AD, when this kind of catastrophic event happens. There's a revolt in Jerusalem, and Rome finally has kind of had enough, and they burn Jerusalem to the ground. They just destroy the city of Jerusalem and expel Jews from Israel and what is sometimes called the diaspora. And that kind of around that time, up until then, like picture if you were in a family that like all your family members except two were Republicans or Democrats. It doesn't matter which one. But like you've got this crazy aunt and uncle that are the opposite party of everyone else, and when you get together for Thanksgiving, it's pretty tense, and sometimes people avoid political conversations altogether, but when it does come up, it's really hard and everybody fights, and this aunt and uncle are kind of the black sheep of the family because they're in the wrong political party or something. For a long time, that's kind of how Judaism and Christianity related to one another. Like from the very beginning, it was difficult for followers of Jesus to continue to relate to their Jewish relatives that did not accept Jesus as the Messiah. But for quite a while, they could, right? And even though they were strained, there were relationships between Jews and followers of Jesus. In fact, many of the earliest Christians while they would meet for Christian worship, probably still interacted with the synagogue, still perhaps interacted with the temple in Jerusalem, and continued to practice Jewish religious practices along with kind of the growing sense of Christian practices. But that all ends very suddenly around 70 AD, kind of after the Romans destroy Rome and kind of begin this pretty brutal oppression of Jews. That Jews in turn tend to kind of like, there's finally sort of a divorce within the family, and followers of Jesus are then kind of cast out and rejected by their Jewish relatives, their Jewish homes, their Jewish families. And kind of like if at some point that crazy aunt and uncle that are in the wrong political party finally just say, okay, you're not invited anymore, to family events. We don't want to communicate with you. We don't want to talk with you. Your political ideas are just too much for the rest of us, and you're dead to us. So what Matthew is probably doing is not so much writing to convert Judaism for all time. When I say it's a very Jewish gospel, it's less that, but it's probably written for followers of Jesus, early Christians who very likely live in Israel and are probably mostly Jewish. And one of the things we're going to see when we get to the book of Acts is a real turning point in the Christian movement is when Gentiles or non-Jews begin to kind of flood into the movement. And that's mostly through this man, Paul, and his ministry of kind of traveling around the Roman Empire and converting Gentiles to Christianity. But in the early decades, most Christians were Jewish. And so Matthew is trying to kind of reassure them that it's appropriate, right? That it's appropriate that you see Jesus as the fulfillment of Judaism. And so Matthew's Jewish gospel really seems to be kind of trying to affirm, I don't know if there's anxieties or fears, but certainly trying to bolster the confidence that a Jewish follower of Jesus in the 10, 12, 30 years after Jesus' death and resurrection would have had about, yes, I am still a good and faithful Jew in my following of Jesus. In fact, maybe I'm particularly faithful. Like maybe the whole point of Judaism was to lead to Jesus. And that's certainly the argument that Matthew's making. So most Jews today don't want to have anything to do with Matthew because they don't kind of accept that premise, right? That Jesus fulfills the Jewish story, that if there's an arc to where the Jewish story is headed, they would not accept that the culmination of that arc or the pinnacle of that arc is Jesus. And not accepting that, they then wouldn't be interested in the argument of Matthew, even though it is a lot more Jewish than any of the other Gospels. So that kind of relates to that question. A third question that came in on a private email. So if you recall, when I was explaining Mark and priority, I kind of had a little picture, right, of a smaller, kind of like 3 stacks, like smokestacks or something, and 3 chimneys. And the smallest one in the middle was Mark, and then Matthew and Luke were next to it. And the argument being that Matthew and Luke kind of take everything out of Mark's column or stack, totally accept it, with small revisions, and then add material onto it. Now, I didn't highlight this in the video because I found in past years it gets a little confusing. So I'm just going to hit on this quickly. But one thing scholars notice is Matthew and Luke both they stack material on top of Mark that's mostly teaching. I mentioned that in the last video. And one of the things that's interesting is quite a bit of that teaching is the same, right? So it looks as if not only are Matthew and Mark cheating from a Turnitin standpoint, cheating by copying Mark, they also seem to have some other source that they have access to. That either Matthew is copying Luke when it comes to Jesus' teaching, or Luke is copying Matthew, or there's some source altogether that we just don't have, that they were borrowing from. And probably the most clear example of this is what is called the Sermon on the Mount, which is kind of a large collection of teachings of Jesus. Like if you've ever heard, blessed are the poor, for they shall inherit the earth, or um, you know, you've heard it said, don't commit murder, but I say don't even be angry at someone. Like that. That's all material from the Sermon on the Mount, um, and that appears in both Matthew and Luke. There's slight variations to the sermon, and we'll talk about that more after break. But it's very, very similar material. Just as so, it looks as if Matthew and Luke are sharing some common source, and over time, about a couple hundred years ago, kind of German scholars were who first sort of developed or noticed or kind of highlighted this shared material. And they didn't know where it came from. So it kind of got this anonymous name for like the mysterious source, this source material that both of them had access to, but there were no kind of existent copies of. And so the German word for source is this word called Quell. Quelle, quell, means just source or unnamed source in German. And over time, that is often called Q. So, like sometimes if you were to pick up a book of New Testament or Gospel biblical studies, you would maybe hear like questions about Q, who is the Q source and where does the Q source come from, and is it Gnostic, or what is this mysterious Q? And it's really just more kind of a theorized source. It's basically just the idea that somehow Matthew and Luke are sharing more than just Mark with each other. They share some other material. Recently, in the last several decades, kind of a prevailing theory has started to develop that really Matthew is Q. So that Mark is first, Matthew is second, and he, the author of Matthew kind of puts in all this teaching material in the Sermon on the Mount. And then Luke has access to both Mark and to Matthew and borrows quite a bit from both and then adds a little bit on it himself. So maybe Q doesn't exist at all. Maybe it's just Matthew. Mark is like Mark 1.0, Matthew is Mark 2.0, and then Luke is maybe 3.0, like the second revision of Mark. And that Luke's brought. I've probably now confused you. I'm not going to test you on Quell. I used to try to have people kind of draw out this whole diagram about how these documents work together, but I found they got pretty confused about it. So really, all I'm going to ask for on the final is that you understand that these three Gospels are sharing quite a bit of material. That's why they're called the Synoptics, and that the prevailing concept in the vast majority of scholarship these days, and has been so for a couple hundred years, is that what they're sharing is Mark. That Mark is very likely the first source of material, and things come after that. Okay, so I'm going to now jump into the text, but as we come back from break, I would love to get questions from you. Love to spend time in one of these videos each week dealing with your questions. Kind of with things being thrown up in the air, I'm less concerned about we've got all this exact material we have to cover. We're going to get to the end of the New Testament one way or another before the final, but we may end up leaving out some stuff. But if we do that, because we're interacting with each other and having questions that I can kind of talk about or address in some way, I'd really rather do that. So we looked a little bit in the last video. We started looking at some material in Mark, and I want to stay there with kind of three quick, hopefully we'll get to three quick passages and talk about them a little bit. So in the first one, we talked about Jesus healing a leper, and that raised all kinds of questions about clean and unclean. How did that concept work in Judaism, and how does Jesus sort of radically alter it, right? Whereas in every other situation, clean is super important, but really fragile and easily ruined. Like unclean things are constantly, clean is constantly in danger of being spoiled by everything that is unclean. Whereas Jesus seems to reverse that. Like he is so pure, so clean, and so powerful that as he interacts with the unclean world, rather than being contaminated by it, he spreads his goodness to it. And he spreads his goodness onto others. And I think I don't want to. I had an intention of trying to kind of maybe tell a story of my experience or thoughts about that. I'm going to pass on that, other than to just say this. Um, some of you maybe grew up in church situations that maybe didn't use the language clean and unclean, but really took seriously that if you were a Christian young person, you needed to avoid contamination by the world. You know, like you needed to avoid hanging out with people that swore or smoked or drank or watched certain kinds of movies, or, you know, just did all sorts of things. You know, maybe even so conservative as, you know, not going in places where they danced or played cards or gambled, you know, or all sorts of things. And I certainly grew up in an environment like that. Um, some of the churches that my family went to when I was a kid were very, very conservative about things that Christians just really needed to not have anything to do with. And as I went through high school, I took that very seriously. I had some very good friends that I ran track and cross country with who were dear friends of mine. But sometimes after cross country meets or track meets, they would go out to this lake on the edge of town and swim if it was an afternoon meet and it was still hot, and drink a little bit of beer. You know, even though they were high school kids, and I never would go with them. You know, they would invite me, and I would just turn them down and never would go. Um, and I had this vivid memory of a specific experience in high school where on the way home from the meet, we got started talking about God. We got started talking about religion and Christianity and Jesus, and they all knew I was a pretty serious Christian, and they had a lot of questions for me, and we were having this great conversation. And it felt like, wow, you know, like I'm finally getting to share my faith with all these guys I've run track and cross country with for a long time. And we got back to the high school, and it was a Saturday morning meet, so it was like early afternoon in kind of in Oklahoma, late September. It was still like 80 degrees, and they were like, "Steve, come out to the res with us, and let's keep talking about God. Let's keep talking about Jesus." And my question was like, "Well, are you guys gonna drink if we go?" And they're like, "Oh yeah, yeah, we always do, but we really, really want to talk more about Jesus." And I said, "Well, I'm not going to go. Like I'm not going to go if there's going to be alcohol there, because I just don't approve of that, right?" And for me, that was kind of like my hedge around the Torah, you know, that we talked about. Um, Sort of my being a Pharisee, my like I have to protect my clean, and being in the presence of you drinking, underage drinking, and really at that point any drinking probably would be sinful, and so I'm not going to do it, right? And what I've kind of looking back on that, I really wish I'd have made a different choice. Actually, you know, like not so much that I would have drank. I still don't really drink at all much now, but I wish I would have felt free to go, and that I would have said, "Hey, the conversation that we're having here is really great, and it's a pure and good and clean conversation, and that I don't need to fear." You're having that conversation while drinking a Bud Light or whatever, um, is somehow going to contaminate me. Like I wish I would have had a little bit more confidence, you know, that not to be like Jesus, but that maybe clean wasn't so fragile, and that it could be in the presence of these sinners and still have the conversation go on. And I really look back at that with some regret. And that kind of leads into this second story from Mark that I want us to spend some time with. So this is in uh, Matthew or Mark 3, and I'm going to just read the story really quickly. Another time, Jesus went into the synagogue, and a man with a shriveled or crippled hand was there. And some of them being some of the Jews, some of the kind of Pharisees, probably, were looking for a reason to accuse Jesus. So they watched him to see closely if he would heal on the Sabbath. So, right, if you remember from Torah, Sabbath is this day of rest, right? This day given because you were slaves in Egypt. I want you to rest, and I want your servants and your children and your animals and foreigners that are working for you all to have this day of rest. And it's very, very important in Judaism, and certainly for the Pharisees with their hedge around the Torah. Obeying Sabbath is super important. And in fact, in the Gospels, we see Jesus interacting with issues of what does it mean to keep the Sabbath quite often, right? Like he will do things on the Sabbath that kind of scandalize people, and they will be like, "You're a good, faithful Jew, but you're working, right? You're working on the Sabbath." So the scene here is, here's this crippled man, and if Jesus heals him, if he performs a miracle to heal him, these religious leaders are going to accuse him of working, right? You are breaking the Sabbath by healing this man's crippled hand. So they are watching to see if they could accuse him and see how closely, to see if he would heal on the Sabbath. And Jesus said to the man with the shriveled hand, "Stand up in front of everyone." Then Jesus says, "What is lawful on the Sabbath, to do good or to do evil, to save or to kill?" But the religious leaders remained silent, and he looked around at them in anger and deeply distressed at their stubborn hearts. He said to the man, "Stretch out your hand." He stretched it out, and his hand was completely healed. And then the Pharisees went out and began to plot with others as to how they might kill Jesus. Right? So Jesus basically breaks the Sabbath. Right? And when I was growing up, for a very long time, I thought that, well, surely that's not what he did. Like, because Jesus is without sin, right? Jesus doesn't sin. And so if breaking the Sabbath is a sin, somehow doing this work on the Sabbath must not really be work, right? Like for the very longest time, I read this passage or passages like it, and thought, okay, I don't, like, somehow there's a loophole, right? Like okay, they only think it's work, but really Jesus is able to explain to them, or Jesus knows in his heart that really I haven't done work on the Sabbath. But over time, I don't think that's at all what's happening, right? Like when Jesus says, "What is lawful on the Sabbath? To do good or to do evil? To save life or to kill?" Um, in another passage, kind of right around this in Luke or in Mark, Jesus says this: "The Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. The Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath." So here's how I'd like to ask you to think about this. And I'd really encourage questions or comments about this particular interpretation of it. When Jesus says, "What is lawful on the Sabbath? To do good or to do evil? To save life or to kill?" Um, like, imagine this scenario. Imagine you're a modern day Christian, and our version of Sabbath keeping perhaps is, I need to go to church every Sunday. Like, it's super important to never miss church. I always have to be at church. That God requires obeying the Sabbath, and in my tradition, which is pretty accurate to how I grew up, like, you've got to go to church every single week. So I'm driving on my way to church, and I pass a car that's had an accident. It's run into a telephone pole or something. And I get there, clearly I'm the first one to pass this car. And it's just happened moments ago. And I can see the driver is maybe slumped over the steering wheel and is pretty seriously hurt, but seems to be alive. There's smoke coming out of the car. It looks like it might catch on fire. And there's a really good likelihood if I just kind of cruise on by and head to church, this driver's going to die. Like this is a serious accident, and I'm the first one. I'm the one who's come upon him. And I think what Jesus is kind of saying here, what should I do? Right? Keeping the Sabbath would say, well, I don't dare help him, because that would be missing church. Like, it might take quite a while to deal with this, wait on the ambulance to come pull this guy out, the jaws of life, and who knows what else is going to be involved, filling out forms. I better just get on to church, right? Because God requires it, right? It's the law, right? It's Torah, and for Jews, keeping Sabbath is Torah. But what Jesus seems to be saying is here: what if there's Torah, and then there's the real Torah? Like, there's the law, and then the law that's even more important. And like, yes, all things being equal, observe the Sabbath. All things being equal, don't break the law. But if you can save someone's life, if somebody is in grave danger and you can rescue them, but it involves doing it on the Sabbath, go ahead and do it. Like, do helping your neighbor in need, in crisis, is more important than observing the Sabbath, right? Like, I really kind of think Jesus is without sin here. I think it certainly is his argument. But the reason he's without sin is not because he has not, in fact, broken the Sabbath. I think Jesus pretty clearly says, "Oh, yeah, I am. I am working. I did heal this man on the Sabbath." But what is more important, to save life or to kill, to do good or to do evil? The man, and let's end kind of this little Sabbath conversation with that statement. The Sabbath was made for you, for man, not man for the Sabbath, right? I think in Judaism, it had kind of become this sense of, and not to say that the Torah required this interpretation, but I think some of the Pharisees of Jesus's time had begun to see, like, we are controlled by our need to keep the law. The law is almost like our master, right? That demands and requires perfect adherence. And like, gosh, I would love to rescue you from that burning car. I'd love to pull you out of this house that's on fire, but it's the Sabbath and I'm forced to let you die, right? And I think Jesus is saying, no, the Sabbath was made for you. Remember? Like, think back. Like, why did they have the Sabbath? Because you've been slaves. You know what it's like to suffer. You know what it's like not to have any rest. So I am giving this to you as a gift, right? I want you to have this Sabbath, this day of rest every week, not to be a burden or this thing that causes harm, but because it's a gift to you, because you know what it is not to have rest. And I think that's kind of the heart of it, or the spirit of it, that Jesus is talking about. Like, the spirit of Sabbath is to serve, to bring life, to bring rest, to bring healing, shalom. And if in a given moment, what brings shalom is helping somebody on the Sabbath, and that involves working, then go ahead and work. And you have kept the Sabbath. You've kept the spirit of it, if not the technical letter of it. Right? So, like, looking back on my high school experience, and maybe some of you would disagree with this, but like, I kind of wish I had gone, to the 7-Eleven down the street and gotten some soda or a Gatorade or something and gone out to the reservoir with my friends, and felt like, hey, what keeping the law of Jesus is today is having this wonderful conversation about faith. And even if that happens now in the presence of my friends that are drinking a little bit, what if that's not the worst thing? In fact, what if that would be a thing that God would really be pleased with? But instead, I was very like, nope, here's the hedge. Like, here's the lines that I have drawn around sinful behavior, and being in the presence of alcohol fit that, right? So I did not go to parties. I didn't go anywhere where high school kids were drinking or smoking or doing any of that kind of stuff in high school. And looking back, at least in that particular moment, I kind of wish I had done differently. So that's a little bit about Sabbath. As you read the Gospels, I encourage you to look around. You will see Jesus talking with people about the Sabbath all over the place, right? And this kind of, I am talking about a law of the heart and not a law that's merely defined by outward observances. And I think not only first century Jews could get caught up in outward observances, but so can we, right? Ours look different. Our Torah, our hedge around the Torah, looks maybe different than first century Jews. Like, maybe it's more around profanity, or what kind of movies, like R-rated movies, or like what kind of violence or sexuality can be in a movie, and before it's a sinful thing, or just all kinds of stuff. But I bet, I certainly was somebody that grew up with a pretty long list of things that I had drawn kind of a pretty bright and firm line around. Like, I won't do these things. I won't be in the presence of people that do these things. And looking back, I don't know that I really understood much of kind of the Torah of the heart. I more understood a Torah of external behavior, right? And I think that's kind of what Jesus is interacting here. So I want to shift gears pretty drastically and flip, staying in Mark, over to kind of a really curious little sandwich of sort of like two stories that are kind of side by side, that at first don't seem related, but then I think really do kind of fit together. All right, so if you'll remember, one of the themes of Mark is this idea that people are confused, right? People Even Jesus's closest friends don't seem to get or understand who he really is and what he's really about. And particularly around this idea that he is not going to be a military savior for them. He's not, he is the Messiah, but he's not going to be king. He's not going to kick out Rome and sit on a throne. And they don't get it. They don't get it. So this is two stories that happen in Mark, side by side, Mark 8. So Jesus and his friends have come to this town called Bethsaida, and as they're walking along, they see a blind man. And the blind man begs for Jesus to touch him. And he says, if you touch me, you'll be able to heal me. So Jesus took the blind man by the hand and led him outside the village. Then he spit on the man's eyes, which is a curious, like, why? Why is that the thing that Jesus needs to do? But that's how he's going to heal this man. He spits on his eyes and put his hands on him and then said, do you see anything? Jesus asked the man. And the man says, I see people, but they look like trees walking around. Right? So Jesus kind of, yes, I'm going to heal you. Let's get to work. Spits on his eyes, touches him, and says, hey, did it work? And the man goes, well, kind of. Like, I'm not blind anymore. I can see things, but it's all pretty blurry. Right? People look like trees to me. So clearly this man probably had sight at some point and lost it because he knows the difference between a tree and people. But he has kind of partial sight, like everything's really hazy. I mean, maybe if you have a pretty intense need for glasses or something and try walking around without your glasses on it, I can see movement and figures, but I really can't make out what I'm seeing, right? So then Jesus once more put his hands on the man's eyes, and this time his eyes were open, and his sight was fully restored, and he saw everything clearly. And Jesus said to him, don't even go back into the village. Right? So this is an odd miracle, right? It's sometimes called Jesus's two-touch miracle. And one of the questions is why? Like, why doesn't it work all the way the first time? Like, why does Jesus need to touch him twice? He's Jesus after all, right? Like he's healed people all over the place. He's calmed hurricanes. He's raised people from the dead. He's done all sorts of miracles. Why this time doesn't it work the whole way? Had he just not had a good hearty breakfast that morning? Was he just not kind of juiced up with healing power for the day and, his batteries on low or something? And I don't think it's anything like that. I think actually the reason it's two touches is because of the story that comes immediately after that. So keep that two touch. Like, yes, I kind of see Jesus, but I also don't really see. Like, I partially see, but things are pretty blurry and confused for me. And see if that maybe doesn't resonate with the rest of this story. So as they walk on from there, Jesus turns to his disciples and says, who do you say that I am? And they began to reply, some say John the Baptist, others say Elijah, others one of the prophets. And Jesus says, well, what about you? Who do you say that I am? And then Peter, who is one of Jesus's closest friends and probably kind of his most impetuous, like he's kind of like if you have a friend group who, like, one of you always just like, let's go for it, like, and jumps out of the car and, like, does the crazy thing, does the bold things, says whatever they're thinking without thinking about the consequences. That's kind of Peter. So Peter immediately says, he's the one that got out of the boat and walked on water, right? In the comparison that we made between Matthew and Mark. Peter immediately answers, you are the Messiah, Jesus. And Jesus warned them not to tell anyone. So again, the messianic secret. And then Jesus began to teach them about how he would suffer many by the elders and the chief priests, and then how he would be killed in Jerusalem and rise from the dead. But as Jesus started to tell this, right? So, yes, you are the Messiah, Jesus. You're the promised one, the one we've been waiting for, right? And what does Peter probably think? And that's going to mean you're going to kick Rome's asses. Like, you're going to deliver us from Rome. And then Jesus goes, correct, right answer. I am the Messiah. Let me tell you what that means, right? And he begins to talk about, I'm going to go to Jerusalem and I'm going to be rejected and I'm going to be beaten and I'm going to be spat on and then I'm going to be killed. Like, the Romans are going to kill me. And then 3 days after that, I'll rise from the dead. And as he spoke about this, Peter took him aside, Like imagine this is Jesus after all. Peter grabs him and pulls him out of the group and rebukes him, which is basically like, shut up, Jesus. That's not what the Messiah is going to do. Like, how dare you? Like, you can't, you're not going to die. You're going to be the king after all. And so Peter rebukes Jesus, and Jesus turned to him and said, "Get behind me, Satan. You do not have in mind the concerns of God, but merely human concerns." Then he goes on to say, "Whoever wants to be my disciple must deny themselves and take up their cross and follow me. Whoever wants to save their life will lose it. Whatever loses their life for me and the gospel will save it." Right? So imagine kind of the really quick swing of emotions here. Like 1 second, Peter is feeling, "Oh, I got it. Like I'm the one who was the first one to recognize that Jesus is the Messiah. I got the question right. I know who Jesus is. And that's so awesome because the Messiah is going to make everything great, right? It's going to kick out Rome and introduce this fabulous era of Jewish dominance and return to power and glory. And then all of a sudden, Jesus is calling him Satan and saying, "You don't understand anything, Peter. You don't get it at all. Like you don't have in mind the concerns of God. You have human concerns." Right? So like what is happening there? Well, like think back to the healing miracle. The man sees. Okay, I can see something, but it's all really blurry. It's all really confusing. Right? That's a whole lot like Peter, right? Like, yes, I recognize, I think you're the Messiah, but he doesn't see, right? He sees enough to know that Jesus is special, that Jesus is important, that Jesus is the Messiah, but he doesn't have the insight to recognize or accept what that's going to mean, right? Like everyone else in the Gospel of Mark, he's confused. And in some ways, this story is kind of a really central turning point or kind of anchoring point in Mark of, yes, I am the Messiah, but I'm a suffering one. I'm one that's going to die. Like my kingdom comes through death and humiliation and suffering. And you want me to be your Messiah. You want to follow me? Do you want to follow me all the way to the cross? Because that's what it's going to take. Right? And Peter is sort of a stand-in some ways for everyone else in this story in Mark. Because everyone else wants Jesus to be the Messiah, but a different kind. Right? They want him to be a political military Messiah, and he's like, "I'm not going to do that." Right? Like you're not going to like the kind of Messiah I am. It's going to be pretty shocking to you. So this story, it appears in Mark 8. It's really, really kind of central to the theme of what Mark is doing in the whole gospel. And I just want to end with the very strange ending of the Gospel of Mark that also kind of drives home this sense of, yes, Jesus was wondrous. He clearly was the Messiah we were waiting for and Jews have been for hundreds of years, but we did not get it. Right, so I want to show you, hopefully you can kind of see this. And I have to figure out how to manipulate my computer. So if you see Mark 16 there, and you look down the page to there's this line, right? And below it, it says this: "The earliest manuscripts and some other ancient witnesses do not have verses 9 through 20. So there's part of Mark, basically what the editors of the NIV and virtually any other English Bible you have will do this. Most modern translations have this kind of demarcation, saying like this probably wasn't really in the Gospel of Mark at first. Like when it says the earliest manuscripts don't have this, that's basically saying this probably got added a couple centuries later. That Mark probably ended at verse 8 in chapter 16, and verse 9 and following got added. Now, that's not a huge thing to be worried about because what gets added is very similar to what's in Matthew, Mark, or Matthew, Luke, and John, right? So it's the added material is not and then Jesus, UFOs came down from the sky and took him away in a spaceship, or he went to North America, it's pretty standard to what the other gospels say about post-resurrection. But here's how what's probably the original or the short ending. Sometimes like scholarly texts, see this described as Mark's short ending or the original ending. It says this, that early on the Sabbath, Mary and the other Mary, the mother of James, and Salome brought spices so that they could anoint Jesus' body. So at this point, these women who think Jesus is dead go to the tomb. This is Easter morning, Sunday morning. Jesus has died on Friday. And they get to the tomb and there's no one there, right? They look and the stone had been rolled away. As they entered the tomb, they saw a young man dressed in a white robe sitting there. And the man said, "Don't be alarmed. You are looking for Jesus the Nazarene who is crucified. He is risen. He is not here. See the place where they laid him. Go, tell his disciples and Peter, he is going ahead of you into Galilee. There you will see him, just as he told you." Right? So we're pretty familiar with, if you've grown up in church at all or ever attended Easter services, like this is the story, right? Like, he's not here. He is risen. You're looking for the living among the dead. Rejoice, rejoice. Jesus is alive. But here's what comes next. Trembling and bewildered, the women went out and fled from the tomb. They said nothing to anyone because they were afraid. Period. And that's where Mark ends, or at least the earliest versions of Mark. They then go on to say, when Jesus rose early on the first day, he appeared to Mary, who he had driven out 7 demons. She went and told others. Afterwards, Jesus appeared to all kinds of crowds, and he told them to baptize people. So, like, Mark totally believes in the resurrection, even in the very short ending, right? You get the young man, perhaps an angel, saying to these women, Jesus is risen from the dead, right? So Mark absolutely affirms that Jesus, his body, he has come back to life. God has brought him back to life. But it seems to end with, even then, we were still confused, right? I was confused, Peter, we didn't get it when he walked on water. Our hearts were hard. We didn't understand what was happening. At time, I thought he was the Messiah, but then he's talked about dying, and I got really angry at him. I didn't get it. We didn't get it. And even here at the resurrection, trembling and bewildered, they went out and fled from the tomb. They said nothing to anyone because they were afraid. Now, it's very clear by the early movement of Christianity that they didn't stay afraid for very long, and they didn't stay silent for very long. Very, very quickly, and as we'll see in a week or two, they start talking a lot about Jesus having risen from the dead. But what Mark wants to say is, Jesus so surprised us. Everything about him surprised us. Like, it was not just like, oh, Jesus is my best friend, and ever since I met him, life has just been perfect and easy, and he solved all my problems, and he's answered all my questions, and I never have any fear or anxiety. In Mark, like, yes, Jesus is the most fascinating, transforming, mind-boggling figure we've ever met, and he freaked us out. Like we were confused and scared and bewildered and often missed the point altogether. Eventually we started to get it, right? I mean, Mark is, how does Mark begin? This is the gospel of Jesus, the Christ, the Messiah, right? So Mark is telling us at the beginning where the story ends. But at the end of what's probably the original version of Mark, yes, Jesus has risen from the dead, but they don't yet understand it. I mean, imagine this, right? Like, it's like, why are they so stupid? Why don't they get that? Imagine if, somebody you dearly loves, your favorite person, you're a huge Kobe Bryant fan and love the Lakers and were, horrified at his death this winter. If, like, 3 days later, guess what? He's not. He's alive again. That would freak you out, right? Like, that would freak any of us out. People don't do that, right? People don't rise from the dead. We, 2,000 years after it, with 2,000 years of Christianity, the resurrection isn't as shocking to us. Like, oh, it's Easter, right? You get dressed up, and maybe you've done Lent and, not eaten chocolate or drank coffee for several weeks, and it's all celebration, and Easter's awesome, and, church is packed and whatnot. But for these folks, it was utterly terrifying. right? It was exciting. It was beautiful, but it was also, what the crap? Like how could this be possible? We saw him die. We watched, we heard, we loved him, and he died. And the Romans, he was arrested, he was beaten, he was put on trial, he was killed. How could he possibly be back to life? Trembling and bewildered, they went out and fled the tomb. They said nothing to anyone because they were afraid. And thank God that that doesn't stay the case for long. But I think I really love this ending in Mark, because I think this is a pretty natural human response to something as bizarre as Jesus rising from the dead. That it wasn't just, oh, of course, we've been waiting for you. Now we can begin Christianity. Let's have Easter dinner, go on an Easter egg hunt. Um, no, this was the strangest, most amazing, most bizarre experience any of them had ever had or ever would have. And I think Mark very honestly tells us that, right? Yes, he is risen, but man, we were scared. We were confused at first. Not for long, but initially. Okay, we're going to end up there. And that's the third video for this week. And kind of after spring break, we'll come back with some more. I will be in touch via email as well. Thank you. Have a great break.